So, since it is false that our bodies can't digest cellulose, here's why. You look at cellulose and it has a very linear pattern, and we're unable to break that down and break those bonds down into its simplistic form. And so, um, it's not really something that can be broken down to provide energy for our cells. And so that's why we're not cows. Cows have multiple stomachs so that they can break that down. But we are able to break down starch, which has more of a branched pattern like this. So we're able to break this bond right here, and we can actually then utilize that starch. Um, so two simple sugars that I'd like you to know the basic structure of, maybe, or just be able to know why they're different from one another. So if you look at these, they might look similar, but there are some differences. For one, this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides. This one only has 5. And so the difference between these monosaccharides is just the arrangement of their atoms. And so that's something important to know, is that the only difference really is just the arrangement of their atoms. Okay, so we're going to move on to lipids now. So the building blocks of lipids are fatty acids, and there are two different main kinds of fatty acids. So there are saturated and unsaturated. So saturated fatty acids are considered the unhealthy ones. So they're going to be completely saturated by hydrogens, and they're going to be most likely solids at room temperature. And some examples of these are butter, whole milk, peanut butter, vegetable oil, and margarine. Um, and then the healthier of the two is the unsaturated, which is less hydrogen molecules, and they're more likely liquids at room temperature. And these tend to be things that are in avocado, olive oil, fish oil, flax, and canola oil. And so these lipids are found in those foods, but they're also found in our cell membrane in something that's called a phospholipid. And so the phospholipid has two parts. Here, this circular portion here is called the phosphate head. And then we have these two portions on here, which are the fatty acid tail. So these fatty acid tails here are going to be the kind of hydrocarbon chain, because when you look at the structure of lipids, they're just going to be long chains of carbons and hydrogens, which I'll show you on the next slide. And so the phosphate head is going to be polar, which, if you remember from the properties of water, that polarity means that it's partially charged, and so it means that it wants to interact with water. And so this polar head is going to be water loving, while this nonpolar tail is going to be water fearing. And we'll talk about more about this when we get to cells. For now, that's kind of the general thing you need to know about phospholipids. So if we talk about the structure of these saturated versus unsaturated up here, we kind of need to talk about carbon first of all. So carbon can form 4 bonds, and we're talking about covalent bonds here. Now remember, covalent bonds are when carbon shares electrons with another atom. So it can share basically 8 electrons, because each one of these means it's sharing 2 electrons. And carbon is the basis for all organic molecules. So that makes it a very versatile element. So if carbon has one line like this here, it means that it's a single bond, so it's sharing 1 pair of electrons. But if there are 2 lines, then that's called a double bond, which means that it's sharing 2 pairs of electrons, so 4 electrons in all. So like we said, there were 2 kinds of fatty acids. We have saturated here, which is saturated with hydrogen molecules. And so almost every place you can have one, it has a hydrogen. And these are all single bonds here, you'll notice, between the carbons. And then it has a carboxyl group on the end. And so that's how you can tell that something is saturated, because it has all single bonds and is saturated by hydrogens. Now conversely, you have unsaturated fatty acids, which have some double bonds, as you can see here, and there are not nearly as many hydrogens throughout the hydrocarbon chain. So that's how you can tell that something is unsaturated, because it does contain some double bonds and it's not saturated by all those hydrogen atoms. Okay, so finally we're going to talk about nucleic acids briefly. We'll talk a lot more about these in the spring when we talk about DNA, but for now you need to know that the building block is a nucleotide, which is made up of three parts: a phosphate group, which remember is polar, a deoxyribose sugar, so a sugar that is specific to DNA, and then a base. So you probably have heard this before, but bases being adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. So this is kind of the structure. This is the phosphate group, this is the sugar, and then this is the base. And then these nucleic acids are what make up our DNA and RNA, which is the basis for who we are. So hopefully that lets you fill in all of your notes, and let me know if you have any questions.